So I just want you to spend a few seconds looking at this slide and just think about it and what does it make you feel? It's like a first impression, isn't it? And I think, of course, what it should look like is something like this, but it's really just a little joke to show you that first impressions count. And when you're writing a research funding application, although you may think, do we really have to bother so much nowadays about nice grammar and spelling? It doesn't half irritate reviewers if something is full of spelling errors and grammatical errors. It makes it much more difficult to read, and it makes people cross. It makes them think either, they've done this in a tremendous hurry, or they haven't really, um, you know, let other people review it, or they haven't thought through the whole thing properly. And I think it's just a little warning, really, that first impressions count. So do please attend to writing and the sort of spelling and grammatical side of your application. Okay, well, I thought I'd start with a few tips from the top when it comes to writing. An edgy first quote to use for a presentation, but it comes directly from Ernest Hemingway. And of course, he's absolutely right. You don't want to be submitting your first draft because it is likely not to be very good. So that's something to think about. One day I will find the words and they will be simple. So that's Jack Kerouac. So again, writing a research grant application, you want to make it as simple and straightforward as possible. You want maximum comprehension. You want people to understand it. And if you use complicated words and convoluted language, you will really annoy the people who have to read the application. The first sentence of a book is a handshake. Perhaps an embrace. So that's from Jhumpa Lahiri. So again, first impressions, things like your plain English summary and what people are likely to read first. Make sure it's really good and people are drawn in to the rest of the application. But for my own part, if a book is well written, I always find it too short. So yeah, maintain your readers' interest, make them want to read it, make sure that it's, an interesting enough read to sustain their attention. Fill your paper with your breathings of the heart. Well, that is a very poetic thing to say. And I think for, an academic, you kind of think, well, of course, you're not going to do that sort of thing. But there are certain sorts of applications, and indeed fellowships are probably the prime example, where showing your own interest and enthusiasm for the subject can make a difference to how reviewers perceive you as a possible candidate for a fellowship. I can write with authority only about what I know well. So of course, reviewers will completely see through an application if you're not on top of your subject area. So obviously you're not necessarily going to know everything. And that's why you have a research team or you have a team of mentors and supervisors to help you. But at the end of the day, you are working in a field, hopefully, that you have some knowledge. It may be that you have clinical or local authority knowledge relating to that subject area, but you need to know something about the area and to be able to demonstrate that. You can't rush inspiration. So again, another warning, take your time when you develop these applications. Don't be crushed by other people's gatekeeping. That said, take a good look at your work and make sure it is publishable and it is going to stand out. So from Bernardine Evaristo, really good advice there. I think the academic career path is not necessarily easy. I always think it's a bit like being an actor going for constant auditions. Failure and rejection is part and parcel of being an academic, and you kind of have to get a thick skin. So it's very competitive, and applications get rejected, but that doesn't mean that your idea isn't any good. It may mean that the competition was particularly hot for that round. Having said that, if you get some feedback, have a look at it, assess it, and take it on board for your next attempt. Okay, so don't get crushed by rejection and feedback. Be grown up about it, take it on board, and improve for the next time round. I love deadlines. I love the whooshing noises they make as they go by. That's Douglas Adams. I'm sure you've all heard of that one. Again, a really important thing. There are deadlines. Quite often, funding schemes have several rounds a year. Sometimes I know they're only annual. If your application is ready, yes, get it in. Obviously, if you miss the deadline, that's a bit of a disaster. But if it's not ready and it's not urgent that you get it in, and I know sometimes people have research teams to sustain, and it's important to get applications in. But if it's not important, let it whoosh by, because it's far better to put in a really well-crafted application than something that is not 100%, because you're sort of, I suppose, setting yourself up for rejection up to a point. So what is a research grant application? Well, it's not a research paper or a research protocol or an ethics application. All of these things are very subtly different. A research paper obviously is the results. The research protocol is really the detailed mechanisms, that everything you're going to do to actually execute your research project. And that's not what necessarily goes into a research grant application. You basically get a flavor for those things. And it's not an ethics application, although there's an overlap between all of these things. It's basically an application for money. It's competitive. And in that sense, it is a sales pitch. So you are competing against other people who are putting in for the same fund. So it's got to be good. There's no point sort of sitting passively and expecting people to know that your application is brilliant. You have to shout about it. So bark and woof and tell people about how marvelous it is and how well crafted and excellent it is. And I know that's quite a difficult thing for us to do. So you must take your reader on an easy to understand logical journey aimed at convincing them to spend thousands or millions even of pounds on you and your project, or you if it's a training program. So it's got to be good. So a research grant application is a sales pitch aimed at convincing a particular funder that your idea is important enough to them, your suggested approach is good enough, what they get will be good value for money, and you and your supervisory or mentorship team are expert enough to successfully deliver the work. So what does a grant application look like? Well, obviously it will depend on the scheme that you're going for. The ones that we're talking about today don't actually have a sort of methodological research plan, which is often the heart of many research applications, but they do all hang together. So they have lots of different bits and they hang together. And sometimes if one of those bits isn't quite right, the whole thing will crash. So these are the usual headings. So this is, for example, for the pre-doctoral fellowship, this is what you'll see. So you have sort of summary information, sort of administrative information. You have information on the lead applicant, quite chunkily the narrative CV and support and mentorship details. In terms of your application details for the pre-doctoral award, it's this research area of interest, which we'll talk more about later. There's also a section on working with people and communities, and that's why it's good to do some of that work up front. You'll have a section on the budget and the justification of costs and various uploads, letters of support, importantly, for you, and various signatories. When it comes to your fellowship application, there will be these other sections, so the scientific abstract and plain English summary, and then the whole section that is your detailed research plan. And at this stage, you're obviously not going to have all of those details, but you may have an idea of those details, and that's something that can help inform your research area of interest. A useful reference I've always found, and one that informs some of this presentation, is the Research Funding Toolkit by Aldridge and Derrington. Derrington also has a useful blog that talks about tips about writing research funding applications. And in it, he says a general principle of grant writing is that you should give the reader the information that they want when they want it. And actually, at the RSS, we spend many hours reading people's grant applications, and you have a kind of stream of consciousness. And if a question pops up in your mind, in a sense, you don't want that. You wanted that to be preempted by the right information being in the right place. Sometimes it pops up a bit later, but really the art is getting that information in the right place so that question doesn't arise at all in the mind of the reviewer. Aldridge and Derrington talk about 4 key propositions in a funding application. The importance, so this programme of work is important, and no one's going to fund something that's not important. Its success, so this program of work will deliver, whether that's a product for a research application with a sort of project involved with it, or whether it's a trained up and ready to go potential fellowship applicant rather, in the form of a pre-doctoral fellowship. It's got to be good value for money. And the competence proposition, the team or the person can deliver what they say they're going to deliver. And in a sense, everything that's written in a grant application addresses one or more of those propositions. We talked in the first session about what is a good research project. So just to recap, obviously, it is important that your research idea is novel. It's something new. We're not flogging a dead horse. It's something that really will contribute or change or improve healthcare, social care, public health. It's important to your area. It's useful, so people can use it, and importantly, it's researchable, so it is feasible. Some things aren't actually feasible to research, so it's got to be something that you can realistically research. So those are the sorts of key things that you need to think about in terms of your research idea. Important to whom? So this is essential to understand. It's the funder's remit, and you can find out about the funder's remit in their mission or aims and objectives, the projects that they funded in the past, their eligibility criteria, and their guidance notes. So you can produce a really well-crafted, brilliant research application, but if it's pitched at the wrong funder, you'll still get rejected. So it's very important to make sure there's a good match between what it is that you want to do and what the funder will fund. Will the proposed programme of work deliver? So for projects, that's about the research plan and whether it will produce what you say it will produce. So is it rigorous, etc. For a training and development type fellowship, will the work proposed deliver or prepare the person adequately? So is it going to deliver a trained person who's ready to take up, for example, a doctoral or a postdoctoral fellowship? Is the plan feasible? So that applies as well to a research plan as it does to your training plan. You know, are you doing too much? Is it over ambitious? Is it appropriately varied? Are you covering all the bases that you hope to cover? And will it deliver useful output? So in terms of a research project, that will be something useful. In terms of a training program, that's going to be a trained up and person ready, as I say, to take on a larger fellowship. Will the work be good value for money? It's competitive. You know, they are going to be looking at whether you're asking a sensible amount of money, and they will ask you to justify your costs, which is all part of assessing that. Are you a credible applicant? So applying for award at the right level for you in terms of your background, expertise and track record, making sure you're pitching in a sense yourself to the right fellowship, that you have support to cover all major areas in terms of a research team for a research project, but in terms of supervision and mentorship, that you've got the right team to cover the bases, and that you have institutional support because the institution has to be happy to be a sponsor for your work. And if they're not eligible to be a sponsor, then they can't really support you. So a research grant application is a competitive sales pitch aimed at convincing a particular funder that your idea or training and development plan is important to them, that your suggested approach will successfully deliver something meaningful, that what they get will be good value for money, and that you and your supervisory or mentorship team are eligible for funding and competent to undertake the work. But even if you have all of those things, unless you can convey them to funders, reviewers, and panels through your writing, you will not get funded. I mean, you may say, well, I get an interview, but actually you only get an interview once you've got through the first stage. So they will be reading the applications and then throwing out some applications at that stage. So actually, you have to get through that hoop. And to get through that hoop, you need to write something really good. There's a big difference between having the idea and presenting the idea. You know, like a picture, research grant application shouldn't be jumbled up, unclear, difficult to decipher, confusing or unconvincing. And that's perhaps particularly more so when you're putting in for a research project as well as a training plan. Somehow it's a lot easier to get tangled up in a research plan. Hopefully a sort of training plan isn't quite so difficult, but we'll still want to see logic and sense to what's being done. So what we're looking for is a nice, clear, unambiguous, easy to understand and convincing application. I guess at the RSS, we see a few sort of brilliant ideas, brilliantly crafted. We see really quite a few really good ideas, but perhaps ones that could be better presented. We see a few not very good ideas brilliantly presented, and you'd be surprised at how far they get actually through the process. And we see a few bad ideas which are badly presented. But it's that top left-hand corner that I think we see most applications, and that's where the RSS can be so very helpful in helping you to craft, to hone, to improve your application as you're developing it. Note, it doesn't matter how good your application is, if you have a poor idea or proposal, if you're not in scope for the funder, if your team or your supervisory team are not qualified to support you in your work, your employer's not eligible to hold the grant, if you're being overambitious or unrealistic, if the research is not good value for money, if you don't follow the guidance notes, if your application is incomplete or you miss the deadline. Certainly NIHR is very tight on its deadlines. There may be other funding bodies that aren't quite so, but unless you've got a very good reason, you want to get it in by the deadline. And you don't want to leave it to the last minute, because loads of people will be uploading their applications at that point, and there's sort of the risk of this whole system crashing and then you missing your deadline. So don't leave it to the last minute. So the prerequisites for a successful grant application is a competitive sales pitch aimed at convincing a particular funder that your idea is important to them, that your suggested approach will deliver something meaningful, that what they get will be good value for money, that you and your supervisory or mentorship team are eligible for funding and competent to undertake the work, and you are able to write a well-crafted, understandable description of your work that will convince funders of all of the above. Obviously, there are challenges, and we are mighty sympathetic to those challenges. Page limits grown. Everybody hates page limits and word counts. You have to get the right information in the right place, and yet you want to make sure that important information is sort of scattered about. So if a reviewer is only reading one bit of the application, they will pick up the important things. Bear in mind that funding panels and reviewers will consist of specialists. That's probably more the case for a research project application, so perhaps a fellowship or postdoctoral fellowship, or a project grant like a health technology assessment or research patient benefit, where it may well go out to expert review. So that's where your subject specialists are going to be, and where they'll get an opportunity to comment on what you've done. So it's got to satisfy subject specialists. It's also got to satisfy non-specialists. The typical NIHR panel will consist of methodologists, clinicians, PPI. So it's got to be understandable by everybody who's not an expert in your field. So that's where disentangling jargon and buzzwords can be tremendously important. So you're trying to please both detailed readers, people who really dive in and look at what you're doing and the specifics and the technical details, but you're also trying to satisfy speed readers who are going to skip through certain parts of the application. For example, if there's a section on statistics, they may say, oh, my colleague will deal with that because I don't understand it. But you still need to be able to guide and allow all speed readers to get the gist of every part of your application. So they need clear pointers. They need relevant information, no waffle. They need arguments, good arguments that appeal to the funder and not necessarily to your discipline. So yeah, something might be really important in your discipline, but actually the funder might not be interested in that. So it's got to make, it's got to satisfy their interests. And you need sufficient detail to assess the quality and the feasibility of the work. And that is quite a big ask if you think about it. I think one thing that's important is the sort of overall structure and symmetry of your application. And these are just some dictionary definitions of structure and symmetry. It's sort of existing arrangement, a mutual relation of the constituent parts. It's about the harmony of the parts with each other and the whole. And I think that's very important in an application. You don't want non sequiturs. You don't want a lack of logic in what you're talking about, or saying one thing in one section that's not held up by another section. And if we look at a typical, so we'll take this as a research project. So this is a project that has research aims and objectives. Everything relates relates to it. So the title will relate to the aims and objectives. The plain English summary and the scientific summaries will both relate to the aims and objectives. The background and rationale will support the aims and objectives and will be reflected in the plain English summary and the scientific summary. The research plan or the training plan and the methods that are written about will also reflect the aims and objectives. They will be reflected in the background rationale and the scientific and plain English summaries. The outputs and impact will obviously result from the research that's undertaken, which will reflect the background and rationale, which will be reflected in the plain English summary and the scientific abstract. The sort of team or the expertise, the mentorship and support that you have with the project will reflect the needs of the aims and objectives, which will be reflected in the research plan and likewise reflected in all the other sections. Your PPI will be crafted to fit the area that you're looking at, and the budget, of course, will reflect everything that you're doing. So it all relates to each other. So it's important that each section reflects the other, and one section is setting up and preparing for the other. So if you think about the aims and objectives, you're looking back at the background and rationale. That will support the aims and objectives. If you flip the aims and objectives forward, everything that you say you're going to do should be reflected in the research plan. If you flip that forward again, say looking at impact and outputs, they should flow naturally from the research plan that you have. So it all fits together. Of course, the story is important, and I'll say a bit more about the story when I talk about the research area of interest specifically, but the story is an oft neglected part of a grant application. People think if I get the methods right, that's the most important bit. Actually, if what you're proposing is not logical, it's not necessary, it's not important, a reviewer can't see that it's useful, then they won't, they're not going to be interested in whether the methods are good or not. So that background rationale is incredibly important. So in a fellowship application or a project-related application, plain English summary, the scientific summary, and background and rationale will be where you will find the story. For a pre-application support award or a pre-doctoral fellowship, the story is largely going to be in the research area of interest. But there's also your story for all of these applications. So the narrative CV is a type of story. It's a story of your life, I suppose, in research and your life as someone who's interested in research. So actually constructing that in a logical way is also important. So story does run through any research funding application, whether it's to do with just training or whether it's to do with the project as well. Style is important. So it's important to keep your application easy to read. So we're talking about headline messages, not convoluted arguments here. We use adjectives sparingly. If they have to read complicated language, it slows the reader down. Only use it if you need it for factual qualification. And if you want to write things like exciting and profound, I would rather let the reader feel it, not read it. So they're picking up your enthusiasm and your passion for a subject rather than you having to state it explicitly, and use adverbs even more sparingly. So here we have an example, a nice literary interlude of a beautiful piece of literary writing. So May in Amenemen is a hot brooding month. Days are long and humid. The river shrinks and black crows gorge on bright mangoes in the still dusk green trees. Red bananas ripen, jackfruits burst, dissolute blue bottles hum vacuously in the fruity air, and they stun themselves against clear window panes and die fatly baffled in the sun, which is how I feel on a Friday afternoon. But in fact, beautiful piece of writing. That's not what your grant application is going to look like. We don't want any of those descriptive words in an application. Keep it easy to read. So don't use typography to emphasize too much text. If something is important, and we'll learn about this in a minute, put it at the beginning of a paragraph. It's actually quite off-putting to reviewers to see emboldened text in the middle of a paragraph. They don't really know where to look. So do be careful how you use typography. You can use bullet points and numbered lists, which are actually a godsend when you've got limited word counts. It's a lot easier for someone to read through a set of bullet points or numbered lists than it is to read a paragraph full of semicolons. So short paragraphs short sentences, simple punctuation. And if you find you're using colons and semicolons, bung a full stop there instead, because it just makes for complex reading. So another literary interlude here, we have a very long sentence, which is actually a paragraph, and you have to take a very deep breath to read it. So in consideration of the day and hour of my birth, it was declared by the nurse and by some sage women in the neighbourhood who had taken a lively interest in me several months before there was any possibility of us becoming personally acquainted. First, that I was destined to be unlucky in life, and secondly, that I was privileged to see ghosts and spirits, both of these gifts inevitably attached, as they believe, to all unlucky infants of either gender born towards the small hours of Friday night. That, as I say, is one sentence. It's also one paragraph, and it's the first paragraph of a book. It is Dickens, it's David Copperfield, which is absolutely, as you all know, absolutely fantastic book. But you have to get used to the style, and it is pretty convoluted sometimes, and it's difficult to read. So I've got another example here. Mia groaned. She hated that word. Learning was the thing her mother valued above all else, but to Mia, learning was just boring. So I don't know. I don't suppose anybody will recognize that. It's by Gwyneth Rees, Cosmo and the Magic Sneeze. So I think probably it's one of my daughter's favorite books. So I think when she was little. So I think the message I'm trying to give you here is think children's book. When you're writing your grant applications, you want nice, short, snappy sentences that are easy to understand. This is just a little exercise. And we can spend a few minutes doing this, a couple of minutes. This is another paragraph, first paragraph of book. It's also one sentence. And I just wonder if you want to spend a few minutes thinking about how you might write this in a simpler way. So yeah, this is the first paragraph and indeed the first sentence of Anne of Green Gables, which many of you I'm sure have read. Again, another beautiful piece of writing. But if we look at it, we can actually break it down considerably. So Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived where the Avonlea main road dipped down into a little hollow, full stop. The hollow was fringed with alders and ladies' eardrops, full stop. It was also traversed by a brook, full stop. The source of the brook was way back in the woods of the old Cuthbert Place, full stop. The brook was reputed to be an intricate, headlong brook in its earlier course through the woods, with dark secrets of pools and pool and cascade, full stop. By the time it reached Lynn's Hollow, however, it was a quiet, well-conducted little stream, full stop. Not even a brook could run past Mrs. Rachel Lynde's door without due regard for decency and decorum, full stop. It was probably conscious that Mrs. Rachel was sitting at her window, full stop. She was no doubt keeping a sharp eye on everything that passed from brooks and children up, full stop. If she noticed anything odd or out of place, she would never rest until she had ferreted out the whys and wherefores thereof. So there are an awful lot of sentences there that you can make out of one sentence, which was the first paragraph of that book. So it's just making sure that your sentences are short and to the point and easy to read. So you're not expecting a reviewer to sort of wend their way around tremendously long sentences. So another aspect of keeping it easy to read is obviously to have breathing space in the text, and the use of subheadings where you can. Now, sometimes funding bodies will tell you what subheadings they want, and they'll tell you not to fiddle with those subheadings. And obviously, you can't do that. But sometimes you can add additional subheadings, underneath what they've suggested, or you can very clearly guide the reader by what you've written at the beginning of each paragraph, that a particular subject is being dealt with. They do often nowadays ask for a particular size font, because actually if we look at this, having a page full of small font is not an easy read for a reviewer. And the thing you have to understand is that, people who review applications probably have a massive pile to get through, and they're not actually paid to do it. So they'll do this as part of their sort of academic duties, and they may be pushed for time. The last thing they want is, a page of 10 point with no gaps and no paragraph breaks and no subheadings. It's difficult to read and it's intimidating and it takes ages. Far better to have a few breaks, and better still, have some informative subheadings, which allows the reviewer to see what's going on, and then it sets them up. Keep it easy to understand, so avoid new or specialist acronyms. Now, that's very difficult when we work in the technical areas of healthcare, or we're working in social care or in public health, where there are terms that we use every day and they sort of trip off our tongue with no difficulty. But actually, people who come in from outside of your discipline won't know what you're talking about unless you explain what these things are. So if you do have to use specialist words or terms or acronyms, make sure that you do define them very clearly, and define them more than once. So there's nothing worse for a reviewer than, on page 35, coming across an acronym thinking, I can't remember what that is, and not remembering where it was defined. It might be on page 10 or page 5. So if in every section, redefine the acronym to just help the reviewer, so they can understand what it is you want them to understand. Again, the same with overly technical language, jargon or buzzwords. We again have a lot of technical language. So sometimes it's relevant and you have to have it in if you're talking about genetic microarrays, or colony forming units, or whatever words that you're using. But what you need is a clear direction. So if a reviewer comes across it and they're not a technical specialist, and they just want to get the gist of what it is that you are talking about, it's worth having a sort of introductory sentence that signposts them. It lets them know that actually there's going to be a very technical section here. You can leave that to the specialist, and the sort of more general reader can sort of skip over it. Be consistent. So consistency between sections, and I think this can be an error. Remember, I was talking about how there should be, consistency throughout. That we're talking about harmony. We're talking about each part relating to the other. Don't keep changing and morphing the words that you're using, like directorate or unit or ward or obesity and overweight. Make sure all of these things are very clearly defined, so people know exactly what you're talking about, and you use the same language throughout. And again, I think there's another difference between more literary or fictional writing, where you're trying to create descriptive and interesting reading, so that you're tempted not to keep repeating the same words. But in fact, in an application, consistency is terribly important, and using that same turn of phrase throughout is terribly important, so people know exactly where they stand. So this is another literary interlude. There was Eru, the one who in Arda is called a Luvatar, and he made first the Aina, the holy ones, which were the offspring of his thought, and they were with him before aught else was made. And it's Tolkien. It's the Silmarillion. My daughter told me I should read this. And to be honest, you need a glossary, a family tree, a map, because there are so many different groups of people, and different people refer to them in different ways. So they've all got 2 or 3 names each, and it just becomes a really difficult read. So Melkor or Morgoth, I don't know. They're all different. Be logical. So logical arguments. We don't want non sequiturs. We don't want a therefore that it actually isn't a therefore. So a logical flow of sentences, paragraphs, and sections, and be careful that you don't contradict yourself. So a couple of little ditties to help you remember not to contradict yourself when you're writing. I've already said avoid spelling mistakes and poor grammar if you can. And if you have difficulty with writing, and that's perfectly fine, a lot of people do, it's worth getting other people to read through your work. So a kind of proofreading, so they can pick up on any spelling mistakes or grammatical errors that are there. Repeat key messages. Again, this is something we're most reluctant to do. I mean, often the structure of research grant applications encourages repetition up to a point, and you do have to be careful not to overdo it. But bear in mind that not everyone will read every section. So if there are important things, you need to probably repeat them in each section. So this is just an example from the NIHR. It's an old career development fellowship, so it's quite a long time ago now, and we're using this with permission. But basically, if you look at this, this is the section that was the different sections, and she talks about her extensive prior work in the scientific summary, her preliminary results in the relevant experience and expertise and experience section, which is like a background to the person section, extensive prior work in the introduction, prior work mentioned in the background, existing system prototype mentioned at the end of the research plan, extensive prior work in any prior work, first prototypes development under ethics issues, existing diagnostic system prototype in the IP section. So in every section, Antonia is letting the reviewers know that, I've already done loads of work on this, and that plays to the success criteria. And if we know there's been a lot of prior work, it's been developing for a long time, it's got to quite a exciting point in its development, it plays to the success criterion, and it's going to help reviewers think, yeah, this is going somewhere. Look at all the groundwork. But whichever section they read, they'll pick that up. Keep it memorable. So there is some psychological basis to this. I believe the magical number 7. People can't really remember more than 7 things at once. So you can sort of chunk group-related information. And this is just an example, where you're using bullet points of related information that a reviewer can then retain in their minds. Keep it formal. So we all know that we can use sort of we and I in applications and research papers nowadays, but obviously avoid abbreviations which might be used in informal writing or dialogue, such as will or shan't. Sort of avoid over personalization. I am not convinced. Again, you want the evidence to speak for you rather than you saying that, because you saying you're not convinced is not going to convince the reviewer. But if you say there's evidence to suggest, then they will believe it. And anything goes really in the plain English summary, because the aim of the plain English summary is to get everyone on board with what you're doing and interested in what you're doing. And if you do that by analogy or by using simple language, then that's what you do, because everyone has to understand that, whether they're an expert or they are a lay representative on a panel. There are a number of writing techniques which I think will be helpful. So there's Assert Justify, which is one of my favorites. So as I was saying, don't use typography in the middle of the text, put it at the beginning of a paragraph. So if something's important, put it at the beginning of the paragraph. Make an assertion, justify it with evidence, rather than arguing the case and conclude, which is what academics tend to do. So we build up to the most important thing, which goes at the end of the paragraph. We want that at the beginning of the paragraph. It helps for simple, direct communication, and assertions can be lifted out for summaries. So this area of work is under-researched. Current therapies do not address this area. Previous work is limited and lacks methodological rigor. This program of work will address prior deficiencies and enable us to answer the research questions raised. So you're saying, this is the problem. This is the important bit. And then you go on to say or justify the statement. Another literary interlude. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of good fortune must be in want of a wife. Again, it's a literary example, but it's a brilliant assert justify, Jane Austen. So a brilliant assert justify. The whole book is about single men in possession of good fortune wanting wives. Similarly, all happy families are like, each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. I don't know if anyone recognises that. So again, although a lot of the book deals with the sort of history, that each there are chapters that punctuate it throughout about the difficulties of the situation. So again, a nice assert to justify in a literary example. So ask yourself, if a speed reading reviewer reads only the first sentence in each paragraph, will they get the message? Because that's what you want them to do. So if we again look at another example from Antonia's CDF, this is her expertise and experience section. So it's not a section we see nowadays, but it used to be the research background to the applicant. And now this is more like your narrative CV in the modern template for fellowships. So she says, I've developed my career in biomedical research, building on my expertise. So basically she's saying there, I already have a career in this area. She talks about her qualifications and her postdoctoral position. I'm well qualified. My supervisors encouraged me to become independent early on. I am an independent researcher. My results have been published here, there, and everywhere. I have a good research track record. I've already supervised various people. I'm already involved in research capacity development. Together with colleagues, she talks about international work that she's done. I have international collaborators in this novel field. And then she talks about her preliminary results showing the feasibility and potential of her research. this project is likely to succeed. And indeed, if you looked in the old days at the assessment criteria for the CDF, she hits each one on the head by the first sentence in her paragraph. So a speed reader would be checking off that list, thinking she fits, she's the person we want. She's ticking all my boxes. This is another example of Search Justify. This is a paragraph from an old DRF, again used with permission. Just have a look at it quickly and ask yourself, is there a sentence that might be better placed? I would suggest you look at this sentence. This is the most important sentence, and in typical academic style, it's right at the end of the paragraph. So if you were speed reading, you'd miss that. So a speed reader will say, oh, look, there was a systematic review published in 2007. That's interesting. In fact, current early warning scores do not perform well at identifying patients at increased risk of in-hospital death due to numerous deficiencies in the methods used to develop them. That's the point you're trying to make. That's the most important sentence in that paragraph. You want that at the beginning of the paragraph. You then go on to justify it. These were the conclusions of a systematic review. Priming is another helpful technique. So this kind of gives advance warning that a reader is going to see something later. So if you talk about the prevalence of something, you're priming for work on it. If you talk about a lack of evidence, you're priming for work on it. If you are saying data will be gathered in a particular way, you're priming for resource requests later on. Previous relevant work by the co-applicant, you're priming for the choice of personnel for the study detail later. So this reflects, again, the sort of thing I was talking about, each bit of the application reflecting the other, making sure that it all links nicely together. If you go down a motorway and you see this sign in a couple of miles down the road, you will see a services, and that's because they're priming you. They're saying, "Are you tired? Think about turning off," and actually it pops up a couple of miles later. Have a look next time. Signposting, and I've talked a little bit about this. It tells the reader important information is coming. It helps to structure and highlight arguments. It allows speed readers to skip or take note, and it ensures detailed readers take note where you should. So in this section, we describe in detail the technical aspects of the lab thing that we're doing, at which point a lay reader might see a nice sentence that will explain roughly what the section is dealing with in plain English. You'll then dive into the technical detail that the technical person will then want to read. We now set out the state of the art. The following work packages will answer these questions. And sometimes when you have these very complex research application forms, I'm thinking sort of MRC and Welcome, where you might have a statistical analysis plan in a different place to your methods, you can signpost. So you say, see more for more detail, see in that section. So it also allows people to say, if they're expecting to see something in one section, it's not there. You're saying, hang on a minute, don't worry, it's in this other section. Linking, connecting arguments and maintaining the narrative allows the reader to see the logic of what you're doing clearly and counteracts some of the bitty nature of some grant templates. So words like, whilst this previous work has shown encouraging results, there are only 2 studies that have looked specifically at this issue. This work will answer one aspect of the question, however. The intervention has been shown to work. Furthermore, early evidence suggests it may be of benefit. So what we're doing here is using connectives, and I'll say a little bit more about those later, to link everything and make a good argument. And if we look at Steve's plain English summary here, he's using connectives very effectively. So good statistical techniques exist to develop a tool for predicting patient outcomes. However, these have not been generally used in the past. He's talking about, in addition, the current early warning scores do not include factors, yet they were intended to be used across all types of patients. Finally, and importantly, etc. So he's making really good use of connectives there to create a narrative, to create an argument that reviewers will appreciate. The use of tag phrases and labeling, again, there are some specialist words. We talked about the fact that we work in technical fields often, and there are turns of phrase that we have to use. Once we've defined them, you can use them, but use them repeatedly in the same form. And as a reader of many applications in the RSS, if somebody starts using a term and you can start using it in your conversation with them, you gain a kind of ownership of it, an understanding of it, and it's kind of okay. So if you're using a technical term like early warning score, and you know it's going to be repeated throughout, make sure it's well defined, and then the reader will get used to seeing it and they will understand it every time they see it. I thought it would be useful to see what salespeople are told, because basically what you're doing is a sales pitch. So I looked at what salespeople are told to do, and I've tried to relate that to research funding applications. So the first one is know your customer. So look at the scope and remit of your funder, follow the guide notes, and respond carefully to commission calls. So if they're asking for something specific, give them what they want. So knowing your customer in the context of research funding is knowing the scope and remit of your funder and actually responding to that in your application. Know your product. So be on top of the literature. And that might be something that you spend some time doing during your pre-doctoral fellowship, because you won't necessarily know it all at this stage. But at the end of the day, you need to be on top of the literature. You need to know what's gone before, know where what you are offering fits in with the picture. Acknowledge the problems with existing products. So again, that's being on top of the literature, knowing the evidence gaps, knowing confidently that you're plugging one of those evidence gaps. Offer a solution to a problem. So produce an intervention or study which addresses the problem and the limitations of previous interventions or studies. Say why your product is better than others. So again, knowing the limitations and producing something that's better or addresses those limitations. Hook your customer. So have a good title, have a fantastic plain English summary. I have heard reviewers say, if I can't see the importance of a project in the plain English summary, I really don't pay much attention to the rest. So it's tremendously important. It's your foot in the door. You must get that right. Make a good first impression. So no typos in the title like I had. Have a great team, good title, and a fantastic plain English summary. Tell a story, so have a logically argued background or rationale, or research area of interest, or a fantastic narrative CV that sort of tells your story. Address objections up front, so acknowledge the limitations of your approach. There is probably no perfect research design. It's far better to be upfront about what the limitations are and then say how you're going to address those limitations, than pretending it's not there, because you can betcha a reviewer will detect where the limitations are, and they'll say, why haven't you done this, or why haven't you said anything about this? So provide mitigation where possible. Differentiate yourself, so a great team, an original idea. Listen and respond to the customer. So thinking of Bernardine Evaristo's comments, respond to reviewers' comments. So if you get an opportunity at round one, say, and they give you a set of comments, address those comments. Don't ignore them, because there's nothing more annoying to reviewers than ignoring what they've asked you to look at. And similarly, if you're at interview for a fellowship, listen to what they're saying, and respond in a sensible way. It may be that they come up with a good idea, and you have to sort of acknowledge that and say, yeah, that's a good idea, I'll take that on board, rather than getting very defensive, which won't work. Dazzle them. So a great team, an original project, a fantastic grant proposal. I think as academics and medics and people working in local authorities, we try to be logical and sensible, and we're all a bit Mr. Spockish in the way in which we approach things. But especially for fellowships, you need a little bit of passion, a little bit of James Kirk sneaking into your application. And finally, give yourself time to do a good job. Include everything that's requested. Don't give reviewers or a sort of remit panel an excuse to chuck out your application because you've missed something, an essential upload, or there's a section missing. Get pre-submission reviews from inside and outside your specialist area. So inside, because of course there'll be technical things that a general reviewer won't understand, and you have to get those right for your specialist readers. But get people from outside your specialty area. Get your flatmate, get your partner, get your mother to read it, and see whether they understand it, because those lay reviewers are also there. There are methodologists who know nothing about your subject area. They need to understand what the project is about too. And keep tweaking, adjusting, and redrafting until your application is basically a thing of beauty. And we can see that the masters themselves take a great deal of time before they produce a beautiful picture.